Alright, and we're back. Great Expectations. This video is going to cover chapters 22 and 23 together, so these were past readings. But chapter 22, we find out that Pip has come and has met Herbert Pocket. Herbert is the son of Matthew Pocket, and Herbert is also the pale young gentleman. If we remember the pale young gentleman, this is the boy that Pip fought at Miss Havisham's. Now we come to find out why Herbert was at Miss Havisham's, and it was ultimately a similar reason as Pip. But unlike Pip, Herbert says that Estella is haughty and capricious to the last degree and has been brought up by Miss Havisham to wreak revenge on all of the male sex. Okay, that's page 186. So Herbert has kind of cracked the code for what is to come of Estella and why Miss Havisham would have allowed them there anyways. So ultimately Herbert is not a fan of Estella, unlike Pip, who, is still fancies Estella. Now Herbert goes on, and we see Herbert and Pip develop a good relationship. Herbert even gives Pip the nickname Handle in this chapter. Herbert also helps Pip with his table etiquette. Now, table etiquette is not something that, I don't practice it. It's not something I would say commonly practiced in America. Some of you may practice it. I personally don't, just because it's a lot. But it's just like which knives, which forks, which spoons you use at certain times, where each plate goes, how you eat, which cup has which drink in it. And Herbert knows all of this, but Pip does not. This is foreign to Pip. He would have been lucky to have anything. He wasn't given meals with different, like, appetizer, entree, soup. He wasn't given that. He was given bread and butter. So you just need one thing for that. So this is all new to Pip, but Herbert takes him under his wing, says nothing of it, and truly helps him. So this builds their bond even more. Herbert informs Pip of lots of things in this chapter, and I think the most important is he informs Pip of why Miss Havisham is the way she is. So on pages 189 to 190, if you did not read this part, please read this part. But he ultimately gives us Miss Havisham's life story. Miss Havisham had a half-brother. Miss Havisham got more of the money when her father died than the half-brother. Then this guy comes along, convinces Miss Havisham to buy her brother out of the brewery. When she does that, he's nowhere to be found and writes her a letter and doesn't show up to the wedding. She was devastated. She was madly in love. Rumor is that her half-brother had planned with this guy to do this, and the only person that had been telling her this is a bad idea was Matthew Pocket. Okay, and this is where Matthew Pocket and Miss Havisham's relationship, we see that strain. We see maybe why he wasn't at her house on her birthday and why she still wants him to be there when she dies. That's on page 191. So 189 to around 191 is that whole story. It's more than what I just said, so look into it. Then we finally go to Mr. Pocket's home, where we meet Mr. Pocket, Mrs. Pocket, Flopson, Miller, and the kids. Ultimately, what we see at the end of this chapter is that Mr. Pocket and Mrs. Pocket have no control over their children, and they're ultimately being raised by Miller and Flopson. Mrs. Pocket is just sitting reading. Mr. Pocket is not there, and Miller and Flopson are trying to solely care for these kids ultimately. On page 196, it says, I saw that Mr. and Mrs. Pocket's children were not growing up or being brought up, but were tumbling up. If you are tumbling, you are struggling. Okay, it's ultimately saying they're not being raised by their parents like they're supposed to be. They're not being brought up in a manner that they're supposed to be. They are, more or less being raised by someone else, and this someone else is struggling to do it. They are tumbling up. They are kind of fending for themselves in this manner. The last important part I want to talk about is on page 195. We're backtracking just a little bit. But this quote says, "On a moderate computation, it was many months that Sunday since I had left Joe and Biddy." Here is our indication of a time jump. So it's now been many months since Pip embarked for London. Which is interesting that he's just now going to Mr. Pocket's house. But let's go ahead and look at chapter 23. It's page 199. We get Mrs. Pocket's name in this chapter. Her name is Belinda. So when we refer to Mrs. Pocket, we can also refer to her as Belinda. Ultimately, Mrs. Pocket is rather useless in the best way to put it. She is useless, she is worthless, and she was brought up to marry someone of wealth. Due to her background, her family almost kind of got wealth. He was a baronet, which means just a British title of honor. But she was raised to find someone with a title. Now, is Matthew Pocket that person? No. Could have been. Had the potential, but just didn't make it. He was supposed to become rich, but he didn't. He went to Cambridge. I mean, a very esteemed man. Should have been someone who got a title, but he didn't. So she kind of just lives her life as though he did, yet spiteful that he didn't. Ultimately, this whole chapter is just showing us that the servants have complete control of these kids. If you look at 201, this part's a little crazy. She had seen Millers, which is one of our maids. She had seen Millers slapping the baby. This greatly distressed Mrs. Pocket, who burst into tears on receiving the note and said that it was an extraordinary thing that the neighbors couldn't mind their own business. Okay, let's just say, if someone is slapping around my child, I am going to be in distress, but in stress, there goes the lights. Happens every video. But if someone is slapping around my child, I am going to be in distress. But I am going to be in distress and very, very mad at the person that's doing it. Mrs. Pocket is not mad at Millers. She is mad because she thinks her neighbors are being nosy and not minding their business. This is absurd. No feelings for her child. Just neighbors, stop being nosy. And this isn't the only example of this we see in the chapter. We see it completely throughout. Going towards the end of the chapter, we see the maids literally having to tell her how to hold her baby, how to take care of her baby. We also see another kid having to tell her how to take care of her baby. And when the kid says this, she gets very upset. It says that a pause succeeded during which the honest and irrepressible baby made a series of leaps and crows at little Jane, who appeared to me to be the only member of the family, irrespective of servants, with whom it had any decided acquaintance. This is saying that baby, of everyone in that family, only acts like Jane is their family member. We see that it has no connection with mom because it's trying to leap out of mom's arms. Mr. Pocket kind of just ignores the children, but the baby is simply only being properly cared for by the maids and Jane. This is sad. And is Mrs. Pocket working or busy? No, she is just so infatuated with the idea of, I should be married to someone with a title, so I shouldn't have to do this. However, she's not. And she's just kind of sitting at home reading a book about titles. That's what she's been reading about. And that's what she connects with Bentley Dremel about, is that book about titles. We also meet Dremel and Startop in this, which we've already kind of met them. We don't see much into them throughout this. We don't even see much of Pip. This chapter is solely kind of like an informative chapter of who the Pockets are and how they act. Yeah, and at the end, it ends with Mr. Pocket and Mrs. Pocket having a disagreement, which they do frequently. So, alright, that's 22 and 23.